I noticed him before I knew who he was. That's the part I keep coming back to. It was a Tuesday morning in November, the kind of cold that gets into your collar even when you've buttoned everything properly. I was standing in the queue at the coffee cart outside the Sora Group building, third in line, running the numbers for the day's audit prep in my head while the barista misspelled someone's name on a cup. He was 2 people ahead of me. Dark coat, no bag. He stood the way people stand when they have no anxiety about time, still, without performing stillness. When the woman at the front of the queue dropped her card and it skidded toward the gutter, he moved to pick it up. One unhurried action. That was when I registered the height of him. He was tall, genuinely tall. Not the kind you only notice when someone is standing. The kind that reshapes whatever space he moves through. He bent down and I saw his hands. Large, unhurried, the kind of hands that seem designed for deliberate things. He held the card out and waited. She thanked him 3 times. He didn't respond to any of them. I remember thinking, someone taught him that manners and warmth are different things. He ordered without looking at the menu. Black coffee, no name given. I was close enough now to see his jaw in profile. A clean line, a slight set to it, the way some people carry their thoughts in their face without realizing. His coat sat across his shoulders with the particular authority of something made for a specific person, and his hair, dark, slightly past the point of neat, one piece that had fallen near his eye. I noticed it, and then immediately decided not to keep noticing it. I was not entirely successful. When mine was ready, the barista said, "Nora!" with unnecessary enthusiasm. I thought I caught the edge of something shift in him. Not quite a look, more the suggestion that he'd filed the name away. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know I was about to spend the next 6 weeks inside his company's books. I didn't know that by the end of it, I'd understand the difference between a man who is cold and a man who has decided that warmth costs too much to spend carelessly. I'm getting ahead of myself. I do that when I'm nervous, even in retrospect. Let me start with the morning they told me where I was going. My name is Nora Vance. I'm a senior associate at Mercer & Lind, a financial advisory firm you've never heard of, because we don't work for people who need to be heard of. We do embedded reviews. We go into a company for 6 to 10 weeks, we sit inside the numbers, and we look for what the numbers aren't saying. We're not auditors in the traditional sense. We're closer to translators. We find the gap between what a business believes about itself and what the documents actually confirm. I'm good at it. I'm precise, I'm fast, and I don't take gaps personally. These are the 3 things my supervisor cited when he told me I'd been assigned to Sora Group for a Q4 review. Sora Group. You've heard of them. Private equity vehicles, some real estate, a logistics company that appeared in the FT twice last year for doing something elegant with supply chain debt. Clean books by reputation. One of those firms that seems to function on a frequency slightly above ordinary corporate life. Harder to see inside. Harder to find fault with. I read the briefing notes on the train. The company had collapsed 8 years ago and been rebuilt from what remained. After a scandal involving the founder, the previous CEO who was not the current one. The details were in a footnote. The kind of footnote you put something in when you want it on record without being in the body of the text. Fraud. A 7-year scheme. 11 million pounds. 43 investors. The current CEO had been 20 years old when it happened. His name was in the briefing once, Kai Sora. I noted it and moved on to the structural documents. Outside the train window, the city had thickened into the specific gray of a November morning, the kind of sky that sits low and presses down, that makes every building look like it's been there longer than it should be. Something in the footnote sat with me in a way I didn't examine. I pressed it flat and kept reading. I was not thinking about the man from the queue, not consciously anyway. The Sora Group building was the kind of building that looks expensive without looking showy. All stone and glass, restrained, slightly colder than it needed to be. I was shown to my desk on the 3rd floor by an EA named Mia. She had the kind of energy that suggests she has decided the world is interesting and is constantly being proved right. She showed me where the coffee machine was, how to use the internal filing system, and approximately which senior partners were worth making conversation with and which ones required only professional acknowledgement. "And the CEO?" I asked, because I was thorough. "Kai?" Mia said. She paused, the way people pause when they're deciding what to actually say rather than what is appropriate to say. "You'll know when he's in the building, not because he makes noise, the opposite." I nodded as though this was the kind of information I'd heard before. "He'll want to meet with you at some point in the first week," she said. "He likes to know who's in his numbers." "That's reasonable," I said. "Everything he does is reasonable," she said. "That's what makes it slightly unnerving." I set up my desk and opened the first set of documents. I was not thinking about the man from the queue. At 11:15, the lift doors at the far end of the floor opened, and the man from the coffee queue walked in. I had 2 seconds before he registered me. I used them to adjust my expression into something professionally neutral. He was looking at his phone, then at the floor, the way people walk through spaces they own. Not inattentive, just unhurried about the details. When his eyes reached my desk and found me sitting at it, he stopped, looked at me for a moment, then continued to his office without a word. Mia appeared at my shoulder within the minute. "He recognized you," she said. "He looked at me." "He remembers things," she said. "That's different." I found out what she meant at 4:15. I was standing in the lift alone on my way back from a 3rd-floor meeting. I started humming, half a bar of something, without realizing I was doing it. I was running the afternoon's findings in my head, mildly pleased with the discrepancy I'd caught, humming. The doors were almost closed. I registered that the corner of the lift I had not looked at was occupied. Kai Sora was standing in it. He was looking at the floor numbers. He had apparently been there when I stepped in. The height of him in the enclosed space was suddenly very apparent. The dark coat, the breadth of his shoulders. I stopped humming mid-note with the particular mortification of someone caught doing something private. A beat of silence. Without looking at me, without any change in expression, he said, "The acoustics in here are actually quite good." Flat. One beat after I would have expected it. I stared at the doors. He said nothing else. The lift opened at his floor. He stepped out. The doors closed. I stood there. I thought, that was either an extremely dry joke or a very unusual observation. I was not certain which. And I was not certain it mattered, because either way, I had been humming alone in a lift that was not, in fact, alone, and the CEO of the company I was reviewing had heard me and had chosen that as the thing to say about it. I took the stairs after that, for about a week. The coffee spill happened on a Thursday morning, 9 days into the engagement. I was carrying 2 coffees down the main corridor, one for myself, one for Mia, who had done me a favor with a document request and who I was attempting to thank in the only language that felt proportionate. A corridor, 2 coffees, 9 in the morning. A senior external visitor stepped out of the lift directly ahead. Someone I hadn't met. Clearly important from the way the receptionist at the far end moved to intercept. I pivoted to intercept as well. I walked directly into Kai Sora. He had come up behind me with the complete absence of sound he apparently moved through the world with. The coffees went, one of them onto his chest, spreading across the front of his shirt at a height that suggested the distance between us was approximately nothing. The visitor was 12 steps away and closing. I did not think. I stepped in front of Kai, back against his front, and opened my folder wide, holding it at chest height like I was consulting a document with him, facing out, using my body and the folder to shield the stain while I greeted the visitor. I was aware, with considerable clarity, of the warmth of him against my shoulder blades. He understood immediately. He said nothing. After a moment, one hand came to my upper arm, steadying, or keeping me in position, I couldn't tell, while I handled the greeting. My voice was entirely normal. I was professionally surprised by how normal it was. The visitor passed. I stepped forward. I did not turn around immediately. From behind me, low, "You're surprisingly good at that." Not quite a compliment, not quite not one. I turned. He was looking at the stain on his shirt. Then he looked up at me. I handed him the remaining coffee, the one I had been keeping for myself. He took it. He did not thank me. He walked away. I watched the way his ruined shirt sat on his shoulders anyway. Perfectly. Unhelpfully. And I started a thought that I decided not to finish. He met with me formally on the Friday of my first week. His office had one glass wall looking over the floor and 3 solid ones. There was almost nothing on the desk except the documents he had clearly already read. He sat across from me, elbows on the table, and said, "What have you found so far?" I told him. 2 structural inconsistencies in the Q2 subledger. 1 vendor payment that didn't match the contract timeline. Nothing that suggested intentional error. All of it correctable. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "The Q2 inconsistency. Which subledger?" "Infrastructure holdings, 3rd column." "I know which one," he said. "I found it in September. We're correcting it in the Q4 close." I paused. "Then I'm noting something you already know about." "You found it in 2 days," he said. "I'm not displeased." A beat. "If you find something that concerns you," he said, "bring it to me first. Not because I want to manage the narrative, because I want to understand it before it becomes a problem." "That's not standard practice," I said. "I report to Mercer and Lind." "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to use your judgment about what needs to go immediately to your senior partner and what might benefit from 30 minutes of context first." I looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing in his expression that felt like pressure. It felt, strangely, like the opposite. Like he was being precise about what he was asking, and making sure I understood it was a request, not a demand. "I'll use my judgment," I said. "Good," he said, and moved on to the next item. I thought about that meeting for the rest of the day, about the specific quality of someone who has things to protect and chooses transparency as the method. It wasn't naive. It was a decision. The following weeks had a texture I hadn't expected. Sora wasn't the usual shade of corporate beige. Careful, polished, everyone performing normalcy around the fact that you were there to find things wrong. The work was alive here. People were genuinely invested. That made it, paradoxically, easier to do my job and harder to stay at the correct distance from it. Mia helped. She brought coffee, sent me internal context without being asked, talked to me in the corridor like someone who had decided I was worth talking to and was not second-guessing the decision. She told me which meetings were worth attending and which ones were theater. She told me the firm's history in pieces, not the footnote version, the operational one. The way you understand a company by understanding how it functions under pressure. Kai was a presence in the building, the way certain kinds of weather are a presence. Not always visible, but always something you were aware of. He moved through the floor with the same unhurried certainty he'd had in the coffee queue. He greeted people by name, without warmth and without coldness, simply accurate. When something in a meeting room wasn't working, someone always went to find him. He always fixed it. Then he left again. I was precise about not watching him. I was imprecise about how often I noticed things without watching. The way he held a phone call standing at the window, very still. The way he ate lunch at his desk with 3 documents open and didn't glance up unless something required it. The way he answered a question from a junior analyst with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. Not impatient, not performing patience, simply attentive. I had spent enough time in enough companies to know what performance looked like. This wasn't it. On a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week, I was in the corridor outside the archive room, reviewing a discrepancy I'd pulled from the vendor files. He came out of the stairwell. He stopped when he saw me, not surprised. He was rarely surprised. More like he'd registered me and was deciding whether the corridor warranted a conversation. "Still here," he said. "I have a discrepancy," I said. "In the vendor file," he said. "How did you know?" "Because it's the only thing in the archive room that I haven't been able to explain," he said. "And you're the kind of person who would find it." I looked at him. The corridor was quiet, the building winding down for the weekend. "What do you actually think of this place?" he asked. An unexpected gear change. His voice was the same, level, attentive, but the question was not a professional one. "I think it's a company that functions like it believes something," I said. "Most of them don't." He looked at me for a moment. "And the numbers?" "Cleaner than they should be, given the history." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one passing through. "Good," he said, and walked on. I stood in the corridor for a moment after he'd gone, with the particular sensation of having stepped through a door I hadn't realized was there. The street save happened on the following Tuesday. I left the building at 6:30, into the particular energy of the city at the end of a working day, everyone moving fast, heads down, the crowd with its own momentum. I had my bag over one shoulder. I was thinking about the vendor discrepancy, which I had not yet resolved. I was not aware of him behind me. A delivery cyclist came fast on the pavement, cutting the corner at speed, not slowing. One arm came across my front, fast, certain, and pulled me back against something solid. The bike was past before I had fully processed the movement. A beat. I was standing against Kai Sora's chest. His arm was across me. The crowd moved around us, indifferent. I heard my own breathing. I looked up. He looked down. His eyes were gray. I hadn't been this close before, close enough to see the precise line of his jaw from this angle. The slight tension I had learned to read there. The piece of dark hair near his eye that I had been trying not to keep noticing since the first morning. His arm was still across me. His face was 6 inches from mine. Neither of us moved. The city was entirely ordinary around us. People, noise, the mechanical fact of a Tuesday evening. It did not seem relevant. He released me, not quickly, not slowly, with the same deliberateness he did everything. He took a half step back. The cold of the air came in where he had been. He straightened, adjusted his jacket, looked at me with an expression that had returned, carefully, to its usual setting. "You all right?" 2 words. The same voice he used in meetings, as though what had just happened was a minor administrative event. "Yes," I said. "Thank you." He nodded once. He walked. I didn't. I stood on the pavement and watched him until the crowd absorbed him, and then I stood there for a moment longer, with the specific sensation of someone who has just had something shown to her that she doesn't yet have language for. I thought about it for 3 days. I did not mention it to Mia. I found out afterward, from Mia the next morning, that Kai had been there the whole time. His client had chosen the venue. Kai had been in a corner of the room with a drink he'd barely touched, doing what he did at events he hadn't chosen, present, attentive. The version of himself that knew how to be in a room without disappearing. Mia said he'd been patient about the whole thing for roughly 40 minutes. I had no idea. Mia had brought me here after a hard week. She had insisted and I had agreed. And then the evening had taken the shape that evenings take when you've stopped tracking them. I was warm from wine, my hair slightly undone, my jacket from the office, but something in me looser than it usually was. Mia said I looked different. I believed her. We were in different parts of the room. We had not seen each other. I was dancing. I am a decent dancer when I'm not thinking about it, which I wasn't, and someone bumped me from the left. I stepped back to correct and hit something solid and warm behind me. 2 hands came to my waist, fast and certain, stopping my fall. I laughed. I recovered. I had not yet looked. "Well," I said, warm from the wine and not thinking, "that's either very good reflexes or you were hoping that would happen." I turned around. Kai Sora was looking down at me. The CEO face had gone, not replaced with anything performed, replaced with something underneath it, something I hadn't seen before, an expression that said something had just landed that he had not been positioned for. There was something in the set of his mouth that was almost, not his usual line. His hands were still at my waist. I became aware of this at approximately the same moment I became aware of who he was. "Mr. I started. "Kai," he said, for the second time. A beat. I was acutely aware that I was warm from dancing and from wine, that I had said something flirtatious to him out loud before I knew it was him, that his hands were at my waist, and that neither of us had moved. He released me, unhurried. "I'm here for a meeting," he said, flat, and then, Apparently. The apparently arrived one beat after the rest. Dry. Not performed. I registered it the way you register when you've heard something for the first time that you hadn't known you were waiting for. I was going to pretend that didn't happen, I said. That's your prerogative, he said. Something in it that I couldn't name. Mia materialized at my elbow. She looked at Kai. She looked at me. She looked at where his hands had been. Should I? No, I said. Yes, Kai said at the same moment. Mia made a face and stayed exactly where she was. Kai's client appeared at his shoulder, young, wanting to introduce him to someone. Kai nodded once at me, once at Mia, with the politeness of someone who has made a decision about what this was, and followed his client. I watched him walk away. Mia waited 4 full seconds. Then, he had his hands on your waist. It was an accident. He didn't move them for about 4 seconds after you stopped falling. I had nothing to say to this. The next morning, I arrived at Sora Group professional and normal, and almost convinced I had processed the previous evening. Mid-morning, Kai walked past my desk. Brief, eyes on his phone, functional, almost passed. Then, without breaking stride, without looking up, "How's your head this morning?" I stared at the back of his jacket. "Fine," I said. "Thank you." He rounded the corner. Gone. Mia appeared in my doorway 12 seconds later. She said nothing. She held up 4 fingers. Then she disappeared. Isabelle Renard arrived in the 4th week. She was introduced at a senior partners lunch as an independent consultant engaged for the firm's restructuring advisory. Elegant, extremely competent, and aware of exactly how she moved through a room. She sat next to Kai. She spoke to him in the particular way of people who have known each other in some previous context. Not intimate, the calibrated, the language of prior access. I watched her watch him, and I experienced something I declined to name. I took thorough notes about the restructuring brief. On the Wednesday of that week, there was a dinner. External clients, 2 senior Sora partners, Kai at the head. I was invited in my capacity as embedded reviewer. I sat 3 seats from him, and spent the evening being professionally engaged while being peripherally aware of Isabelle, who was 2 seats closer, who laughed easily, and looked at Kai in the way of someone who finds a man interesting and is not particularly concerned about concealing this. He was attentive to her the way he was attentive to everyone. Complete, level, returning to whatever she said with full engagement. I could not tell, from 3 seats away, whether this was professional courtesy or something else. I decided it was not my area. I drove home alone. I thought about the vendor discrepancy. I did not think about how Kai's hand had briefly touched Isabelle's elbow as he'd redirected her toward the exit. A small gesture, barely a second, and how my chest had registered it before my thoughts got there. It registered again now. A tightening, something without name, present and unwelcome. I held the steering wheel and let it pass, the way you let something pass when you've decided not to give it a name. By the time I reached my street, it was manageable. I did not think about it again until I was in bed. I found the ghost contractor in the vendor files on a Thursday morning. It was buried, not sloppily buried, carefully buried, in the kind of way that suggested someone who understood how audits worked and how far most reviewers actually looked. A contractor with legitimate registration, real invoices, real payments, except The work described in the invoices didn't match anything in the project records, and the payment timeline had 3 gaps that didn't align with the contracted deliverable dates. 11 payments over 14 months. Total, £340,000. I sat with it for 2 hours before I did anything. I went through every alternative explanation. I checked the registration details 3 times. I pulled the parallel vendor records for the same period to see whether there was a pattern. There was a pattern. I thought about what Kai had said in the first week. Bring it to me first. I thought about what my professional obligation actually was. I thought about what kind of person I was going to be about this. I went to his office. He was on a call. He saw me through the glass wall. Something in my expression must have communicated that this was not a routine check, because he ended the call in under a minute and opened the door. "Sit down," he said. I sat. I put the documents on his desk. I walked him through what I'd found. He did not interrupt. He did not perform calm. He was simply calm, in the way of someone who has rehearsed for difficult information for a long time. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents. "I didn't know about this," he said. "I know," I said. He looked up. "How do you know?" "Because the gaps in the payment timeline align with periods when you were traveling. Someone was using your absence as cover." He looked at me for a long moment. "It's internal," he said. "Not a question." "It has to be. The access level required to structure this." "Yes." He closed the documents, put his hands flat on the desk. "Thank you for coming to me, and for assuming the worst about the situation, rather than the person." I wasn't entirely sure what he meant. Then I was. He meant, "Thank you for not assuming it was me." "The payment structure excludes you," I said. "The authorization signatures are from the CFO level." He nodded. He was already somewhere else in his thinking. I could see it. The way certain problems require the full capacity of a person, and the conversation becomes secondary. "I'll need to report this to Mercer and Lind," I said. "I know. Give me 24 hours to prepare a response document. 48 is better." "I can give you 36. He looked at me again. 36. Yes. There was a quality to that look that I stored somewhere I intended not to revisit. I stood to leave. Nora. The first time he'd used my name. I had heard it once before. From the barista, the coffee cart, the morning I didn't know who he was. Kai had heard it then too. Filed it away. This was different. Direct. Weight in it. I turned. "I'm going to want to have dinner with you," he said. "Not now, not while you're reviewing this firm. After." I looked at him. "I'm telling you in advance," he said, "because I think you're someone who does better with information than with surprises." "That's accurate," I said. "Then you know," he said. "After this is over." I left his office. The floor was busy around me. I walked back to my desk and I sat down and I opened a document I did not read for approximately 4 minutes. The 36 hours after finding the ghost contractor were the strangest of the engagement. I wrote my preliminary report. I sent it to my senior partner at Mercer and Lind with a note flagging the internal nature of the issue and the CEO's awareness. I recommended we proceed to formal documentation within the week. Kai was building something in parallel. I could see it in the way the building operated differently for those 36 hours. Conversations ending when certain people approached, meetings rescheduled. A quieter version of the firm's usual motion. He was gathering evidence before anyone could move it. He walked past my desk twice. Both times he looked at me. Not to communicate anything, just the way you look at someone when their presence in a situation matters to you and you want to confirm they're still there. Both times I looked back. On the second evening, he came to my desk at 7 o'clock. Most of the floor had left. The building had a particular quality at this hour. The corporate hum gone, only the low breath of ventilation and the city's amber light pressing in from outside. The empty desks holding the shape of the day that had just ended. "Go home," he said. "You've done what you needed to do." "I have 3 more documents. They'll be here tomorrow. Go home." I looked at him. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, jacket gone. The tiredness of the past 36 hours around his eyes. The first time I'd seen him look anything less than fully operational. "Are you all right?" I asked. He considered the question in a way that suggested he was not used to being asked it by people who actually wanted to know. "Yes," he said. Then, "It's manageable." A beat. He was close to my desk, closer than usual. The kind of proximity that happens in an empty office when there's no professional geography to navigate around. He chose not to. That was what I understood that evening. Whatever this was between us, the almost of it, the proximity, the things left unfinished, he had looked at the situation, looked at me, and decided not to. Not because he didn't want to, because he thought the situation didn't permit it yet. "I know," I said, to the documents on my desk. He waited for a moment. Then he left. I sat there after he'd gone and felt, very precisely, the weight of a choice that had been made without discussion, in the space between what was said and what wasn't. Mia told me on a Friday morning, 10 days before the end of the engagement. We were in the small kitchen on the 3rd floor. She handed me a coffee and said, "Can I tell you something about Kai?" In the tone of someone who has been deciding whether to say something for a while. "Yes," I said. She told me about the fraud. Not the footnote version. The version she knew because she had been working at Sora Group for 3 years. Because she had pieced it together from what people said around her and what the company's structure revealed if you looked carefully enough. Kai's father had been the founder. The fraud had run for 7 years. When it collapsed, 43 people had lost money, some of them everything. Kai had been 20 years old. He had watched every session of the proceedings. And then he had spent the next 2 years doing almost nothing except deciding what kind of company he was going to build with what was left. "He built it clean," Mia said. "Every structure, every documentation layer, every transparency measure. He built it specifically to be the opposite of what his father built. That's what you're reviewing." I held my coffee. "He doesn't talk about it," she said. "But he's also not hiding it. He put the footnote in his own public documents. He could have buried it more than he did." "I know," I said. I read the footnote. "He put it in," she said, "because he wanted to look at it." I looked at her. He once told me, she said, that his father never looked at the people he'd taken from. He said he'd made himself look at each of them in the room. He said the least a person could do was look. I was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Mia looked at me with the particular patience of someone who is not going to answer a question whose answer is obvious. She left. I was standing alone in the kitchen with my coffee when my phone buzzed on the counter. A news alert. The Sora fraud, the original one, Kai's father, was resurfacing. An investigation piece in a financial publication. New interviews with former investors. A question about the extent of Kai's knowledge at the time, whether the current company's clean record was genuine or constructed. It was not true. I had spent 5 weeks in these documents, and I knew it was not true. I looked up from my phone toward the glass-walled office at the end of the floor. Kai was on a call, standing, completely still. I could see his face from here, the angle I didn't usually have, through 3 walls of glass, the city behind him. I saw pain on his face. Not the controlled version, not the management, the thing underneath. A precise, private pain. The kind that comes from something landing in the same place it has landed before. I had spent 5 weeks in this building, and I had never seen him look like that. I looked at the news alert. I looked at him through the glass. I put my phone in my pocket. I went back to my desk. I opened the documents. I was thorough for the rest of that day, more thorough than I needed to be. The last 10 days of the engagement were the quietest. The CFO had been suspended pending investigation. The ghost contractor had been traced to a payments administrator in the CFO's team, someone who had been running the scheme on delegated authority. The firm was cooperating with its external counsel. The story was, as far as possible, contained. Kai was in 8 hours of meetings a day. When he appeared on the floor, he was entirely functional, attentive, precise, nothing wasted. He did not come to my desk. He looked at me exactly as often as the situation professionally required, which was not often. I filed my final report on the Wednesday of the last week. It was thorough, accurate, and commendatory about the firm's structural transparency. I did not flag the dinner invitation in the report. It was not professionally relevant. Mia brought me coffee on the last morning. She sat in the chair across from me and didn't say anything for a while, which was its own kind of thing. "You're good at this," she said eventually. "The review?" "All of it," she said. And then, "He's going to miss having you in the building." "That's not, I know what is and isn't appropriate to say," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." I packed up my desk. It took less time than I expected. 6 weeks of work, and most of it had been on their systems anyway. I walked to the lift. I pressed the button. At the far end of the corridor, Kai's office door opened. He came out with a document, said something to his EA, looked up. He saw me. We were 30 feet apart. The lift was coming. He held my gaze for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, very still. The weight of him at that distance somehow exact. Then he nodded, once, with the same precision he brought to everything. A small, deliberate acknowledgement. The lift arrived. I got in. The doors closed. I stood very still on the way down and thought about the specific weight of a look that says, "I know," and "not yet," and "this isn't finished," all at the same time, without saying any of them. He called me 11 days later. I was back at Mercer and Lind, my usual desk, already 3 days into the next engagement, a hospitality group in Canary Wharf. Clean books, no complications. I had been thorough and professional, and I had not thought about Sora Group more than 4 or 5 times a day, which I considered progress. My phone showed a number I didn't have saved. I answered. "It's Kai." I was quiet for a moment. "I know," I said. "Are you free this evening?" I looked at my screen, at the Canary Wharf documents, at the calendar that said nothing important after 6. "For what?" I asked. "Dinner," he said. "The engagement is over." "It is," I said. "Then yes or no," he said, not impatiently, with the particular economy of someone who has thought about this and does not need the surrounding conversation. "Yes," I said. We agreed on a time and a restaurant. He ended the call. I sat for a moment. Then I went back to the Canary Wharf documents, and I was extremely focused for the rest of the afternoon. He was already at the table when I arrived. He stood when I came in, not performatively, simply as a matter of course. He was in a jacket without a tie, the most casual I had ever seen him. His hair was slightly past the point of neat, the way it always was. The piece near his eye, that I had stopped trying not to notice. We ordered. We talked. The conversation was not easy exactly, but real, which was better than easy. He asked questions with the same full attention he gave everything, and I answered with more honesty than I usually applied to first dinners. At some point between the main course and whatever came after, I stopped tracking the time. He told me about the company he'd built before Sora, a logistics startup that had failed in year 3. Not spectacularly, just quietly. The particular education of a quiet failure. I told him about the year I'd spent in corporate law before realizing the numbers made more sense to me than the language, and about the partner at Mercer and Lind who had told me I was wasted in law, which was both accurate and the rudest compliment I'd ever received. We were in the restaurant for 2 hours and 15 minutes. When we left, he put his hand briefly at the small of my back to guide me through the door, then removed it with the same deliberateness he did everything. Present, then not. The absence noticed. On the pavement, he looked at me. "There will be more evenings than this," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. He looked at me for a moment, with something in his expression that I was starting to learn to read. Not quite a smile, the thing underneath it. The thing that passed through only when he had forgotten for a moment to manage it. He put me in a cab. He did not kiss me. He stepped back and the cab pulled away. I sat in the back of it in the November cold and thought that I was in considerable trouble. My phone buzzed, an unknown number, not his. "I know who you had dinner with. You should ask him what he did to James Henley." I stared at the screen. I didn't know anyone named James Henley. He called me at 7 the next morning. "Are you at home?" "Yes." "Stay there." He paused. "Please." 2 hours later, he was at my door. I had spent the 2 hours reading everything I could find about James Henley, a former Sora Group investor, one of the 43 from his father's fraud. Dead 3 years ago, heart failure. A son, Marcus Henley, who had given several interviews about his father's losses, who had a social media presence that read, if you looked carefully, like someone with a sustained grievance. Kai came in. He sat across from me. He put his elbows on his knees. Marcus Henley, I said. He looked at me. You already found it. I had 2 hours. He was quiet for a moment. Then, his father was one of the people my father took from. Marcus has spent the last 3 years attempting to associate me with the original fraud, suggesting I knew, that I benefited. Did you know? No. Flat, without defense, which was more convincing than any defense. What are you going to do? I'm going to document everything. The relationship history, the evidence of what Marcus has been doing, the timeline. And then I'm going to decide whether it's better to respond or to wait. What's the CFO connection? He was quiet for a beat. The suspended CFO is Marcus Henley's cousin. I looked at him. The ghost contractor scheme, he said, was not incompetence. It was structured to create the appearance of deliberate misconduct at my level, so that when the story was published, there would be documents that seemed to confirm it. Someone built a case against you from inside your own firm, I said. Over 14 months, yes. I sat with this. I need someone who knows the documents, he said, who has already read them, who I can trust to look at what I'm putting together and tell me if it holds. He looked at me. I know what I'm asking, he said. It's outside the engagement. It's outside your professional obligation. You can say no. I know I can, I said. I looked at him, at the tiredness around his eyes, at the precise and controlled way he was managing something that was not, I understood now, only a professional crisis. It was the original wound, reopened, 20 years later. His father's failure, arriving again in a different shape. I'll help, I said. But I'm going to tell my senior partner at Mercer & Lind what I'm doing. Yes, he said. Of course. We worked for 36 hours, his documents and mine, spread across my kitchen table and then the floor when the table ran out of space. He worked the way I would have expected, methodical, precise, without wasted motion. And he worked fast, which surprised me slightly, because thoroughness and speed usually trade off against each other. With him, they didn't. Around 3 a.m, the second night, coffee from a machine that produced something technically describable as coffee, there was a natural gap in the work, a moment while we were waiting for a document search to run. I made the mistake of looking at the stack of receipts we'd been sorting, and said something about the quality of the filing system. He looked at the receipts. To be fair, he said, they were filed by someone who was actively trying to frame me. I'm not going to critique the alphabetization. One beat of silence. I almost laughed. I stopped it, but not before something crossed my face. He looked at me for a moment. Something, very small, shifted in his expression. Then he looked back at the documents, and the moment closed as though it hadn't opened. It had opened. He told me about his father around 4 a.m. Not the legal facts, those I knew. The personal account. What it had been to be 20 years old reading a document that reframed the previous 2 decades. The particular architecture of that betrayal. Not just personal, but structural. The scaffolding of his own sense of what was possible, collapsing at the foundation. He had sat in every session of the proceedings. He had made himself look at each of the people his father had taken from. He had spent 2 years afterward deciding, very deliberately, what kind of company he was going to build with what remained. I spent 2 years deciding what kind of person I was going to be, he said. Not reacting, deciding. The city was quiet outside. The documents were arranged around us on the floor in careful groupings. He was sitting with his back against the sofa, jacket gone, tie gone since sometime around midnight. He looked tired, in the way people look when they have stopped managing the tiredness. That's why the structures, I said. Yes. Every transparency measure, every documentation layer, you built the opposite of what he built. I tried to, he said. It's not a guarantee, as this week demonstrates. It's different, I said. You know it's different. He looked at me. I know. A beat. We were close. Not deliberately, the way you don't notice proximity when you've been working alongside someone for 36 hours, but actually close. 2 feet apart. His back against the sofa, me sitting across the documents. I've been thinking about kissing you, he said, since approximately the 3rd week of your engagement. I looked at him. I thought you should know, he said, given the context. The context of my kitchen floor at 4 a.m. surrounded by fraud documents? I said. Yes, he said, that context. He raised one hand and pressed it against the side of her face. His other arm came around her, not pulling, just present, enclosing. She was acutely aware of the geometry of him, how much of the world he occupied from this close. The particular sensation of being enclosed by someone very large and very certain. Not trapped, the opposite, like the world had become a smaller and safer shape. She had been professional and careful and competent for 6 weeks in that building, and for the weeks after it, and the thing she had not realized she was carrying put itself down. He kissed her, slow, deliberate, unhurried, as he did everything, but warm. She was aware of his chest against her. His hand had moved from her cheek to her jaw, tilting it slightly. She thought, this is what decided looks like. Not swept away, not performance. A decision, arrived at over a long time, finally made. When it ended, she did not move immediately. His arms were still around her. She stayed in that space for a moment. The city below, the building quiet, the particular stillness of 4 a.m. after 36 hours of work. She thought that she had spent her entire adult life being competent and self-sufficient and careful. And this was the first time in a long time that she had been somewhere that felt, with this specific weight of the word, safe. She did not say any of this. She did not need to. He held her, just for a moment. Then he stepped back enough to look at her, checking she understood, making sure, his thumb at her jaw, very light. Nora, he said. I know, she said. 4 a.m. The documents will still be here. I know that too, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the documents, and she did the same. And they kept working as the city outside began its slow negotiation with the approaching morning. The formal response went out 3 days after that. a prepared statement from Sora Group's legal team, accompanied by a documentation package that they had built across 36 hours, and then refined across another 48 with 2 lawyers and my senior partner at Mercer and Lind. He had looked at what I'd brought him and said, with the specific careful phrasing of someone who is both impressed and mildly alarmed, "This is not what I assigned you to do." "I know," I said. "Is it accurate?" "Yes." "Then we'll support it," he said, and went back to his coffee. The news story, when it published, had less traction than Marcus Henley had clearly anticipated. The documentation package arrived the same morning. By the afternoon, 2 of the original investors had given statements contradicting the narrative. By the end of the week, it had moved to the back pages. Kai called me when it was over. "Thank you," he said. "You would have gotten there without me," I said. "Faster with you," he said, and a pause. "Better." I was quiet for a moment. "Complicated isn't wrong," I said, which wasn't a response to what he'd said, not exactly. More like a thought I'd been having for several days that had found a moment to arrive. "No," he said, "it isn't." He came to my flat on a Saturday morning, 10 days after the story stopped moving. After the documentation was filed and the news had moved on, and the 36 hours existed only in memory. I opened the door. He was in a coat, no tie, the same unhurried quality he carried everywhere. He had a coffee from the cart outside my building, one for me, one for himself. He had figured out the order without being told. I let him in. He sat at my kitchen table, where we had spent 36 hours on documents that were now filed, resolved, and no longer relevant. He put the coffees down. He looked at me. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "All right," I said. "I don't do things provisionally," he said. "I don't know how to be interested in a person and simultaneously manage the exit." I looked at him. "I'm telling you," he said, "because I think you're someone who does better with information." "You said that before," I said. "It's still true," he said. "I wanted you to have it again, with more context." I thought about the coffee queue in November, the lift and the acoustics, the coffee on his shirt and his hand at my arm, the street and the arm across me and his eyes 6 inches from mine, the Friday corridor, the bar and his hands at my waist, the 36 hours and the 4 in the morning, and I've been thinking about kissing you since approximately the 3rd week. I thought about the precise, deliberate weight of a man who moves through the world making decisions rather than gestures. "I corrected your CFO on my first day," I said. "You already knew the number was wrong. I noticed that then, too." A beat. Something crossed his face. The almost smile, the real one underneath. "So yes," I said. "Figure it out." He looked at me for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee. I picked up mine. We sat at the kitchen table in the late morning light, and neither of us filled the quiet with anything it didn't need. He never made promises. He made decisions. And I was learning to understand the difference.
She trusted him before he'd explained anything. Would you have?